You're listening to a Monster Kid podcast.
Hi and welcome to A Dingo Ate My Movie, a podcast that features classic Ozploitation and other weird, wonderful, overlooked and underappreciated Australian films from the 70s, 80s and beyond. My name is Pete and I'm your host.
The Night Rider. That is his name. The Night Rider. Remember him when you look at the night sky.
So today I'm joined by Matthew and we're discussing Stone from 1974. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you very much. It's nice to dip my toe back into the world of exploitation cinema, especially Australian exploitation cinema, and especially this particular film, which is an interesting combination of circumstances.
It's a really interesting movie and I hadn't seen it for years and I watched it again on the weekend and a little bit later I watched it, like you, watched a couple of documentaries, and my memories of it were so wrong. I was thinking it was something almost completely different. When I watched it again, I thought, oh, wow, it's really good. I have a lot to think about, a lot to say about this movie. It's quite an interesting movie. It's really easy to, it's one of those movies I found that the storyline is really basic, but it's very easy to remember these nice set pieces in the movie. It's got a couple of really great set pieces.
It's also this, when I say a weird combination, it's like you take a bunch of counterculture acting students who, you know, they all came out of NADA. NADA, is it? NIDA. You know, which is Australia's like premier acting school. Every single actor immediately graduates from NIDA, does a stint on Home and Away or the former Neighbours, and then goes off and becomes the superhero for Marvel or DC Comics. And that's generally the chain of progression. But this is back in, you know, we're talking like what, 1970s? 74. These guys are coming out, and they have it like they're definitely part of the counterculture. Like, you know, the counterculture is in full swing at this point, and it's affecting them. You know, that's affecting the way they see things, how they're feeling about the country. The great playwrights are out there writing things like The Removalists, you know, which questions authority. And, you know, there's a lot of movies coming out that do question authority. And I feel like Sandy, the director, locks into that very quickly. But I feel like it's somewhat misplaced because he has this real hippie-ish sort of attitude to everything, is very anti-authority, anti-establishment, and somehow romanticizes the bikie gangs. You know, and then overlays this like anti-war narrative on top of that. You know, so it's like not only the titular characters in this movie, they're a bikie gang, but they're also comprised of ex-Vietnam veterans and ex-Korean veterans, and they've all sort of come together to form this sort of new age hippie collective. And if you've played around in true crime for as long as I have, you know that it's absolutely the furthest thing from the reality of what a bikie gang is, not only in Australia, but in the rest of the world. But for Sandy, that's the vehicle he uses, to get across those, anti-counterculture sort of statements that he's making about the era he's growing up in, you know, cause it's like, for me, it's almost like watching a mockumentary on the Manson family. Only they're a lot nicer, than the Manson family. And yeah, so I find it, I find it very interesting that he happens to put all of this sort of stuff together. And when you're watching like Umbrella Entertainment, which no doubt you've talked before on your podcast, doing amazing work with restoring Australia's cult films and finding these cult classics. You know, they've got this massive slew of special features, and they've unearthed these documentaries. All the other actors also seem to be down with his vibe. You know, they all sort of feel, you know, those counterculture statements that he's putting out there. And, you know, it's interesting listening to some of these guys, and they're like, oh, you know, I just finished a stint with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and now I've come over to do this. And, you know, which does did you want to talk about the director and the cast before I get too ahead of myself?
We can, yeah. I was going to go through, just, you know, very quickly go through a synopsis and through the major players. Yeah, we can do that. So, but yeah, I mean, I can see you're excited about it. You just love this movie. So
I love all Australian cult cinema. I really do. When we did a dream of mine came true not too long ago. I finally convinced my co-host Holly Soul of the Weird Crap in Australia podcast, which is where I hail from. Well, I finally convinced her to do an exploitation series on Australian cinema because we dipped our toe in it, and that meant Holly and I sat there together and we watched, I think it was like 2 to 3 Australian exploitation films a week, and we went through like your classics. You know, it's like Dennis Hopper's Mad Dog Morgan, and that's the first time I watched Stone. Actually, recently you did a film we covered that I have a soft spot for, Nightmares.
Oh yeah, I love that movie. It's not a great movie, but there's just something about that movie that's so fun.
There is something about that movie that's so fun, and
it's very brutal too, in a way.
It is, and it's also like there's that. No, you know what? Before I go too much further, Pete, I'm going to be quiet for a minute. We should introduce the movie that we're actually talking about.
Let's do that. So, when several members of the GraveDiggers Outlaw Motorcycle Club are murdered, Sydney detective Stone, played by Ken Shorter, is sent to investigate. Led by the Undertaker, who is the director, Sandy Harbutt, a Vietnam War veteran, the GraveDiggers allow Stone to pose as a gang member. Leaving behind his society girlfriend Amanda, played by Helen Morse, Stone begins to identify with the Undertaker and his comrades Hooks, played by Roger Moore, Toad, played by the amazing Hugh Keays-Byrne, Dr. Death by Vincent Gil, Captain Midnight, is it Bindi Williams, I think, Septic, they have so great names, Dewey Hungerford and Vanessa, who's played by Rebecca Gilling, who always says, whenever I see these interviews with her, I was known at the time for getting naked or taking my top off.
Yes.
She always talks about that. Yeah.
I've watched, you know, another film that we used for the basis of our series was Not Quite Hollywood, which is one of the best documentaries you're ever going to watch on Australian cinema. It's so good. And she does like 3 separate interviews about 3 different movies, and every time she talks about getting a kid off. Yeah. And then, because her sort of claim to fame is post this movement of Australian film, she winds up in sort of highbrow Australian drama, you know, not necessarily these shows I'm about to mention, but like things like All Saints and McLeod's Daughters. That's where her career sort of settles. While the 1990s, you know, Australian film switches to more highbrow stuff. You know, you don't get an Australian film out in the 90s unless it's co-financed by Screen Australia. So if you were Sandy Harbutt in the 1990s going up and being like, hey, I want to make this bikie film about the counterculture, Screen Australia would tell you to go away. One of the actors you mentioned there, of course, Hugh Keays-Byrne, the infamous Toad Cutter from Mad Max, and then Immortan Joe from Fury Road. He is just so wonderful to watch. There is something about that man. He reminds me of a cat, right? He just has these very, you know, if you saw him in like a live action production of The Wizard of Oz and he played the lion, you know, it would make sense. Or if he was in Cats on Broadway, sadly passed away not too long ago.
A few years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and he's always wonderful in these movies because he's an actor that portrays, especially in this film and especially in Mad Max, he's someone that appears like they're high, but he's not. I think he's just a very good actor.
Yeah.
But he has that glassy, glazed over poetry that I think very few people can pull off convincingly. Because when you do watch him in this film, just like in Mad Max, I don't feel like his performance is over the top. Like, I don't feel like he is part of the exploitation genre. I kind of feel like he was perhaps 20 years too early. Like, I think he would have done very well with the current era of film that's out and about. It's like just recently the Oscars happened and Everything Everywhere All at Once, like, picked up all of them. And that would not have happened 20 years ago. That's your English Patient. It's definitely not a multiversal adventure film starring, Asian American actors from all walks of life with, like, crazy action scenes and Jamie Lee Curtis kicking ass. Like, that just doesn't happen. But I kind of feel bad for him because I feel that the way he acts and the way that he moves about and interacts with everyone in these movies, if he was, like, doing A24 films now, that would be his...
He'd be perfect.
Oh, he would. He was just born into the wrong era of filmmaking.
Yeah.
And as I noticed, especially in this film, because he plays a secondary character, and, if you loved his performance in Mad Max's Toe Cutter, in this, it's because it's a secondary character, you don't get as much screen time with him, but all of that flavor is still there. And when the other actors just go with it, it's so good.
Yeah.
Because he elevates them as well. He elevates their performances as well. The main Sergeant Stone, Police Officer Stone,
Ken Shorter, yeah,
has to be one of the strangest. The whole film is strange.
It is, like, yeah. I probably should finish the synopsis as well.
Yes.
Basically, anyway, it's pretty simple. Amid violent confrontations with is it the Black Hawks? Is that the other gang?
The Black Hawks they were the actual real bikie gang.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. A rival, the Gravediggers, hold responsible. Stone uncovers a political conspiracy behind the killings, which they don't go too deeply into.
They don't at all. They really don't.
It's just like, oh yeah, there's some guy in a dark room saying kill all the bikies. But and when the truth is revealed, Stone must choose between his job and his loyalty to the Gravediggers. So it's a funny movie because when I first watched it, the first watch I had of it, I was like, I'm not sure what I think of this movie. Like, I like it, but it's very basic and it's very strange. And the lead, Ken Shorter, is not the greatest actor. And that first scene when he's on his motorbike in that white suit with the white helmet.
And the little rose on his shoulder.
Yes, I'm like, what the fuck is this?
Yes.
It's strange.
In one of their behind the scenes interview, they're talking about that, and they're like, "Oh, he's the idea is he is a knight in a silver suit of armor."
Yes,
and that little rose that he's wearing is meant to be the first splash of blood on the suit of armor.
There you go.
Which is pretentious wankery at its best, honestly.
I heard someone other. I don't know if it was in the same documentary. It was someone else. They drew parallels with him and Frank Spencer, and they had a clip of Frank Spencer. Yeah, that was quite weird. Yeah, he's an interesting character. Like, I don't know that he's a great actor. There's better actors in this movie.
There is,
him.
Yes,
but he has to carry this movie basically. And I think there was some issues there, but it kind of works. There's a few scenes that are a bit awkward, I think, but on the whole, he does enough of a good job to carry it.
Yeah, he's not egregious, but it's like, you're right. Like, if they'd found a way to maybe replace him with someone who, I don't know if you can understand the material, because I don't know if the material is understandable.
Yeah.
But someone who I think played it up a little bit more. Like, I think he played it so straight that he comes across as flat, which is quite unappealing in a film where you do have people who are really like over the top. Like even Sandy Harbutt in this movie, I think does a pretty reasonable job for what I would describe as a vanity piece.
I actually think he does a great job.
Yeah. Like, you know, it can go so terribly wrong. You can end up with like Tommy Wiseau in the room, for example. And I think in this particular film, Harbutt has... I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I'm trying to church it up a little bit because it's sort of just the way it's written. It could be just Sandy Harbutt. I don't know whether it's Harbutt or Harbutt.
It's Harbutt, I think. It was double T, so it has to be Harbutt.
Harbutt.
Yeah.
So, you know, he goes out and he writes this movie in response to how he feels about the counterculture, and he directs it, and he writes it, and he stars in it. And those three things can usually lead to an epic failure. And in this case, it's a very strange film, but in the fun sort of way, and not even in a way that I could pick it apart and say, you know, this doesn't work or this doesn't work. It's all of these weird themes. Going back to that, the synopsis you mentioned, there is at the start of this film, because I was like yourself, I didn't know if I remembered it 100% right. And I was like, oh yeah, bikie gangs and some hyper violence, and there'll be a breast or two at some point. I'm watching the movie, and it opens with a political assassination.
Yeah, that makes no sense, really. It's really weird because that guy is we learn has been hired by this guy in a dark room to kill off all the bikies. So why is he killing a climate protester?
I have no idea. And my only guess is that obviously Sandy is he's politically engaged at that point. When you start talking like mid-1970s, you're talking about nuclear disarmament. You're talking about oil. You're talking about whales being killed. So it's definitely something that's on people's minds politically, especially if you're a fresh uni student just out the gate, because you would describe the political statement of this movie as a very left-leaning film. But the problem is, I feel like this is what does happen when you don't go through and do another edit. And that is, you want to put all these ideas into your project because you really want to get it across. But sometimes for the greater narrative to be served, you sort of got to drop an element or two. And I think his writing it, directing it, acting, he's the one that's gone out and got the financing. I think it puts him into a position where he doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to clean things up in editing. He can just put in whatever he wants. And, as a sometimes writer myself, I wrote a graphic novel for a guy who owns a character called the Killaroo, and it's very similar to this movie. The Killaroo is a mutant kangaroo that was made in a lab, and he is essentially adopted by a bikie gang. So
that would make a great Ozploitation film.
I would love. We've discussed. I have discussed with the owner and creator of the character, Darren Cross. I've talked to him extensively about the idea of a Netflix animated film or something like that, and how fun that would be. But when I was writing that book for him, I had a couple of different people and some industry veterans like Jason Browder, who just came off drawing a wonderful Joker Harley Quinn book, an alternate reality Joker Harley Quinn book. He's a Melbourne boy, lives over in America now. Those guys who had been veterans within the comic book industry were able to go, okay, what are the core ideas that you want to get across in this script? And I was like, well, I want to hit this, 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 and this. And they're like, well, these two things work well together. This one doesn't work with these two things, but you could do these three things, but these two things have to be moved on. And the reason I bring up that story is not to tell how awesome I am because I wrote a comic book, but so I can, explain that process, that method. And I think because Sandy isn't being held accountable by anyone but himself, maybe something got stuck in there that he never was able to quite fully realize.
Yeah.
Because it's like, if you look at the execution of the environmentalist at the start, the clandestine man in his little room, and this sort of overarching plot that somehow they're going to frame the bikie gang for it, it never pays off. You know,
it doesn't.
We never get to the end of the film, and that sort of subplot never pays off because I kind of feel like it was abandoned. So, honestly, you could get rid of both of those scenes and the movie works perfectly fine.
Yeah, it wouldn't make much difference. The movie ends really abruptly, too.
This is always what seems to happen with these sort of films back in the 80s. It's like, did they just run out of,
In
like...
70s, yeah.
70s, 80s, yeah.
They do tend to do that, don't they?
They just
sort
stop.
of go, okay, that's the end of the idea.
Yeah.
Let's stop the movie.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of classic movies that have done that I've covered. There'd be a few.
I actually...
Just finish.
I rewound, rewinding it, you know... Well, I don't know what you would call it. I tracked backwards to make sure that I hadn't missed a bit. Because it's like... You know, after Stone is one of those characters that, like, he's supposedly a bit of an uptight cop. You know, he's kind of that good guy who has a very specific way of thinking about things. And then he ingratiates himself with the bikers. And then at the end of the film, there's this moment where he can either deal with an aggressor the bikie way, and that's how the bikies want him to deal with it. They want him to deal with the bikie way, or he can deal with it as a police officer. And so he chooses to do that, and that's all kind of fine. Like, you know, he goes back to his normal life and he's talking to his model girlfriend and he's like, oh, you know, I kind of like these guys. Like, I kind of like their honor amongst thieves attitude. I kind of like how they're all counterculture-y. And then they just invade his home, beat the shit out of them, and then credits roll.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost like they're punishing him. They're punishing the character for not becoming part of the counterculture. But then at the end, I guess he has a redemption because she goes to call his commanding officer and, you know, he stops her from doing it. It's like, no police. And then hard credits.
Yeah.
You know,
it's interesting because, like, his arc through the movie is obviously getting closer to this bikie gang and becoming one of them. And he actually kind of respects them, right? At the end, by the end of the movie, he has respect for them and understands why they do what they do. And for them, sure, he obviously pissed them off by going the route that he was supposed to go, which is the legal route, taking whoever the shooter guy was and taking him off to the police and getting it done that way. I still think they were a bit heavy-handed beating the shit out of him like they did.
They did. Like, if you look, like, the makeup effects, and there's plenty of, like, hypercolor blood throughout all of this, but on the makeup, there's one point where it looks like his cheek has been exploded outwards.
It does.
Like, they've kicked the crap out of him so much. His cheek has literally exploded. He's choking on his own blood. And, yeah, he hangs up the phone so she can't call the police to suggest, like, I understand this is my fault. This is the bikie way. I'm like, no, you should probably be a little bit angry about this. Like, you didn't really do anything that wrong.
Well, no, and I was thinking if the gang wanted to send him some sort of message to say we didn't agree with what you did, but they still obviously at the end of the movie they still had respect for him. Right? The gang kind of took him in and had some respect for him. You would think maybe they'd do him over just to teach him a lesson, but they wouldn't absolutely beat 3 shades of shit out of him. Right?
Yes, yeah, so, he's practically dead.
He's almost dead.
Yeah, at the end there of the movie, and I guess, like, I think for me, you know, what they were doing quite early in film history there is what would eventually become the cop turned sympathetic bad guy. You know, like your Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze in what was that movie called? Point Break.
Point Break, yeah.
Yes, with Gary Busey before he went too crazy. You know, you've got stuff like that. Your Fast and the Furious, your Departed. Like, that's all about, like, the cop ingratiating himself, and then he sort of, you know, he becomes familiar with the people, and they sort of have a little family, and he's like, oh, you know, they're not so bad. And I feel like Stone sort of probably does that earlier. Like, they sort of lock onto this genre before it even really becomes a genre. I feel honestly that the problems generally the problems that this movie has that doesn't elevate it past an exploitation film is probably Sandy Harbutt's writing, to be fair. Because if you cut out the introduction with the execution, I would probably replace that. This is what I do, unfortunately. I just sit there and go, I know how to fix this. Because, I'm going to be a pretentious wanker and I'm going to fix this movie for them. But it's like the first introduction, the execution, you get rid of that, you replace it with just some bikey hoodlum insanity. Maybe it's like the two gangs are involved, that more of them get killed than the other guys. So it's like they're like, come on, Stone, we need you to go in here and sort this out. Like, make friends with the leader, and then we need you to bring him in and shut this all down. And then you can still explore your counterculture elements throughout the body, just like Sandy Harbutt does anyway. He does all of that throughout the body. So you just keep that the way it is. And then you get rid of the clandestine smoking guy. And then instead of having just the ending being they break into his house, beat the shit out of him, and he doesn't call the police on them, you could extend that out to a bigger confrontation, being like, I have to bring you in, you've done the wrong thing, and I'm still a cop, and all that sort of stuff. I think that's probably how they could have done it. But yeah, when it comes to a vanity piece movie, you're always going to have to deal with the fact that the director, writer, actor wants to hit certain beats. And I think, there's always the risk when writing anything, and I've had that experience myself. There's always that risk of wanting to show the world how clever you are. And I think that is probably what happens here.
Yeah,
as
he was too close to it.
Yeah, and he wants to hit these really hidey things. Like he wants to, he wants people to think about the environment. He wants to think about veterans' rights. He wants you to think about evil corporations. He wants you to think about weed culture. He wants you to think about the way that we all interact within a society and how we feel about the common criminal. On top of that, though, I feel like he also has trouble setting that up properly in some respects. Like when you're first introduced to the biker gang's hideout, which is, it's an old sort of shitty building just seen out at the front of Sydney Harbour, which would now be worth, $5
gazillion.
Yeah, $5.1 million in today's money.
Well, that's Middle Head, isn't it, where they shot that?
Yes, and it's definitely what that thing that they found is definitely an example of brutalist architecture as well. Which Sydney has a little bit of brutalist architecture. London was full of it, and we got a little bit of it. So if it's like you head down to Darling Harbour, and you'll see all those like cube buildings, all those brutalist buildings, and it looks like that's where they've set these guys up. But we're going through their hideout, and it's like nothing they're doing seems to be that confronting.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm looking at it with a modern lens, but they're going through this bikie hideout, and I half expect at some point Shredder comes out with the rest of the foot ninjas, because these bikies are like, they're playing pinball. There's like one very weird, awkward sex scene, and then they just seem to be just smoking pot and playing pinball. Like it doesn't saying man a lot. Yeah, come on, man. How you? I
was actually thinking one of the viewing. I never got to do it because I thought it would be too tedious, but it would have been fun. I was actually going to sit there, and every time someone said "man," I was just going to mark it off, because I reckon they must say it about 500 times in that movie.
They do. It is the. It's
probably one of the criticisms I have. It's a bit too over the top, the man bit.
Yeah, well, and again, I think that comes down to like needing that second edit. Needing to be a little bit more critical.
Another set of eyes.
Yes.
Yeah, to sort of say, maybe you should pull back on this, because. Yeah, I understand it's like in the 70s, and I lived through the 70s, so I know, there was a lot of that talk and shit. I still call people man, but the amount of the word man in that movie is like totally over the top. But you know what? It's funny. Like, it sounds like we're pissing on the movie a bit, but I actually still really enjoy it. I still think it's a good movie.
I do as well. And, you know, when I'm being critical of it, and I will be critical of everything I love, you know, just because that's what I enjoy. This movie is far better made and edited and acted than, say, a contemporary like Mad Dog Morgan. Like Mad Dog Morgan, it's messy. It's not very well edited. It's not even framed that well. Like the framing of Mad Dog Morgan is kind of all over the place. So, you know, in the example of this era of Australian cinema, I'm sure you've talked about this before, where there was basically, you know, you had this incredible tax write-off where you could give a film $500,000. You get to take that off your tax bill, and then every profit that comes your way is also not taxed. Like, you know, which meant that there was a ton of exploitation film made, like Nightmares, where you could just hand a shitty director like $500,000, and then, you know.
My favorite story from Nightmares was when they had the script written. I think it was from Nightmares. They didn't have a script, sorry, and they were trying to sell it to some investors. So basically, what was the original script? They had a script for some other movie that wasn't even related, and he put it in a bundle, and he put on the top of it something that said Nightmares on the top. And he went to this meeting and showed it to them, didn't let them read it. It looked like he had the whole script and everything. And this is the sort of filmmaking they're doing. It's like seat of the pants sort of stuff. And
it really is. And Nightmares is like the perfect example of that, where he walks around all those financiers and he's like, hey, I'm going to make the Australian version of Halloween, which, you know, like Halloween, like that's nearly an untouchable film. You know, I've bought every single copy of that from VHS all the way up to 4K. Like that movie is like John Carpenter's films are like up here, whereas Nightmares is, you know, how can we make a softcore porno without calling it a softcore porno, to the point where they made the film and then they went out and shot more like nude scenes to quickly chuck in for the trailer. So it's this interesting era of Australian film, and that's why like the output is crazy good. You know, you got Nightmares, you got Thirst, you got Stone, you got Mad Dog Morgan, you've got all of these tax movies being made so that business people can avoid paying their taxes that year, and you have this crazy glut of Australian films coming out. But Stone actually has, I would say, 70% of things done right, where they could. I don't think, like, for me, Australian cinema canonically becomes proper cinema with Mad Max, because they bought those really wonderful lenses because they were cheap, and so everything had to be panoramic. You know, everything had to be big, and that's why it feels like a film, just because they're using those very special lenses. Stone is very, very close to that. You know, because whoever is behind the camera on Stone actually knows how to shoot. They generally know what to get. Like, there aren't those sort of messy shots that you would expect.
Yeah.
Production-wise, there are some very interesting choices. How do you feel about the bikie gang's motorcycles?
So they were, what were they, Kawasaki 750s or something?
They're very colourful, very pastel.
I think in that day and age, so I think, yeah, they're not really bikies bikes, right?
They're not, no.
No. And I understand at the time, you know, I think if you were to probably look at that scene, so we've got that great scene where they've got the funeral procession of the bikie, they're driving along towards Hawkesbury River on the M2, M1, or whatever it's called.
And they got this like custom motorcycle built for the coffin. Which is really cool. Like I'm not ragging on that whatsoever. But
I was like, they had, I think, if I remember correctly, they had 16 members of the cast in that scene. And before that was all done, Sandy Harbutt put out this note to all these bikie gangs or whatever, saying, hey, we're filming this scene. We just need some people on bikes. And apparently they had over 400 people turn up just for that. Right?
Yeah,
they had a biker come in from Western Australia, I found out today.
Yeah, they had this huge procession of people. He said, like, he had to go up and down with the bullhorn calling out to everyone, you know, this is where I need you to be. This is what we're going to do.
Don't look at the camera. Don't smile. Yeah.
You know, and you can't do that today.
No.
Like that's like if you're going to pull off something like that, you need police. Everything has to be cordoned off. You have to have your permits. You have to put in your OH&S safety plan. Like you can't do that these days. So, you know, it really is a flying by the seat of your pants. The only comparable thing that I can think of is just recently when they started making The Mandalorian and Jon Favreau didn't have enough stormtroopers. So they just put a call out to the 501st, the cosplay community. And they're like, we need some stormtroopers. How many do you have? And they're like, how many do you need?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. But the point I was getting to with that procession, the funeral procession, I guess if you wanted to see what real bikies ride, if you were to look at that procession and try and find the bikies that weren't the actors, because those bikes are probably very different. Yeah, they're pretty yuck little bike. They're just little Kawasaki 700s or something like that. And they were like, it's probably part of the production that's not that realistic, but I'm assuming because of budget, they were able to get them from Kawasaki or something and you know, give them enough of a showing that it's kind of like free advertising for them and that sort of thing.
They're all the same make and like all of them are riding the exact same bikes. Like they're all the same make and model, and you would expect when it comes to a bikie gang that you'd be more inclined to see, you know, your Harley Davidsons,
Ducatis, and those sort of things.
Your big road hogs. Which is like when you get to Mad Max, that's all you're seeing. You know, you're seeing your Ducatis, you're seeing those big. And look, George Miller did the exact same thing. Hey, we need people who know how to ride bikes. Can you ride a bike and be in our movie? And that's how Australian film had to be made. Like there was, you know, I think he said he had a production budget of $155,000. $155,000. Whereas he originally sort of envisioned it with $500,000. I couldn't imagine him trying to get $500,000 for this sort of film. You know, the other thing that surprised me as far as production goes is that it's not as exploitative as I'm used to with these sort of films, you know, because like watching a lot of the footage of the very first, you know, red carpet and having all the bikies rock up to the red carpet down in Melbourne, and the old news footage is like, you know, Stone, like shocking audiences around Australia. It's honestly, it's really not that bad. I mean, the violence is nowhere near your Mad Max levels of violence. The nudity, I guess, could be described as over the top, but it's like
there's a little bit of full frontal nudity, especially the beach scene where they're.
I'm glad you brought that up.
I think we see Sandy Harbutt a full frontal in that.
You definitely see Sandy's hard butt.
Yeah, you do, and you see the front too. And
yes, but it wasn't filmed in a nasty way though.
No, it wasn't. It didn't seem too. This is where it's interesting. It didn't seem too exploitative.
Yeah.
It seemed like it was natural for what they were doing. They just happened to go to the beach at dawn. Stone says, hey, it's the best time of the day. Let's go for a swim. They all go with him, and they're all in the water, and they're all naked and stuff like that. And,
it seems like honestly, watching that, it to me, it just seems like a bunch of film student kids having fun in the ocean. And it's not shot. Again, it's not shot in a nasty way. It's not shot in a grotesque way. It's not there to titillate the audience. It's just, you know, this is a group of people. I get for the purpose of the movie, what it serves is to reinforce that idea of a hippie collective.
Yeah.
You know, that's what they keep pushing forward. Because there are scenes in the film that are definitely exploitative. You know, there's one of the actresses, they're playing strip poker. So, you know, that to me felt... you know, that definitely felt within the realm of exploitation. It's like, you know, if you're not familiar with exploitation film, you're going to see nudity, you're going to see extreme violence, you're not going to see much of a script. But yeah, like Stone manages to avoid a lot of that. So I'm not quite sure, number one, why it was given an R rating back in the 1970s. I mean, Alvin Purple was far more rude and crude and out there than this film was. I'm just dropping exploitation film names so that people know that I know my shit. So it's like you've got those sort of films out there which are so much worse than this.
Oh, yeah.
But for whatever reason, people appear via that old news footage to be generally perturbed by this movie.
I think it's probably the connotation of the bikie thing and the bikie culture. Even though, like we were saying, they're not in this movie, they're kind of like gentrified bikies in a way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
They're not like real bikies, right? Like real bikies would behave completely differently. And we know that. Yeah, right. So
they generally, like, they're emotionally available to each other, which is weird. They just sit around smoking a lot of weed, and they live in this little collective bubble, and they're very counterculture, and they're a bunch of ex-veterans who have a chip on their shoulder, rightfully so, about, their treatment by the government at large. There really isn't much bikiness going on with these people. They're just literally hippies who to me, it's like a group of hippies that realize the hippie movement was over, figure they have to transition to something else, and no one sent the memo out there, hey, we should probably be riding Harley Davidsons and maybe doing a little bit more of a harder drug than just weed.
Yeah. I think the other thing, though, is that scene you're talking about, the scene where they're all sitting around, they're talking about how they came together, and they're all stoned, and you see the point of view of the camera work that gets blurry and goes in and out and all that.
I was waiting for
really
the flash.
Love that scene.
I do too, but I was waiting for my flashbacks.
Yeah.
So it's like everything's going
no budget for that.
No, there was not. Oh, because everything goes shimmery, and I'm like, okay, cool. We're going to sort of maybe they're going to cross to like maybe one of like their time in Vietnam, or maybe just them all meet. Nah, it's just blurry because they're all high, but they're all talking about themselves. And I agree with you. That's
a really great scene. I really like that scene because they're all sitting back. They're all very relaxed, and you actually get some character development. You get to understand how they came together and why they are what they are. And I think it's really good. And I think this is where this movie has resonated with a lot of bike culture people. Not necessarily bikies. I think bikies love it. It's one of those, just looking at some of the documentary footage and some of the other stuff I watched, it's really popular with that whole bikie culture. And a lot of people saying it's the closest thing to a real bikie film. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure I've seen that many bikie films. It's definitely not. It's definitely better as a bikie film than Easy Rider.
Yeah.
But Easy Rider is definitely a better movie.
Yes.
I just think it's interesting how it resonated. And you probably watched that same documentary as me. What's it? Because it's Stone Forever or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that there has this culture that people love the movie and they go on rides, and they actually even have like a little informal bikie gang that loves this movie, and they do all this stuff, and they're talking in the thing. And this is what a lot of bikies do is, like they do rides for kids' cancer and stuff like that, and raise money here and there. And but like I said, the bikies that you see interviewed about this movie, I would consider very gentrified bikies as well.
Yeah, because there's a very big difference for people. So we haven't delved into too much like organised and gang crime on Weird Crap in Australia. We're mostly focused on your serial killers and spree killers and guys like that. We do plan on dipping our toes into that into the future, but there's an important delineation to make between outlaw bikie gangs that are trafficking in drugs, your Hells Angels, your Comanches, your Rebels, and people who enjoy bikie culture, who are mums and dads in their, their early 40s, early 50s, who are like, I want to go back to the old days. And, they do that. They gather up. They go out and they grab toys for kids for Christmas. And like when I was growing up, one of our teachers, lovely woman, she would always go on the bike rallies because she had a bike. She loved the culture.
Yeah.
I think that's where maybe Sandy Harbutt doesn't quite know the film he's trying to make to a certain extent, because he's like, I think he wants to show Like, he has this romanticized version of what these people are, and the very nice people that he's encountering are not a bikie gang.
Yeah.
You know, because it's like, if you look at, again, you know, I don't mean to keep bringing up Mad Max, but it's a really nice sort of companion movie to this movie. It's like when you go to Hugh Keays-Byrne as toe cutter in Mad Max, that's a bikie gang.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, yeah. See, that the bikie gang in Mad Max is what you would expect a bikie gang to be.
Yes.
They're nasty. They, you know, are willing to do anything to do what they want to do. And, that is a bikie gang. And I don't think you don't see that with stoners much. Like I said, it's like a gentrified bikie gang. And it's interesting when there's that scene at the pub, the big brawl at the pub. So the other bikie gang is apparently were all bikies. You can see the difference in them. It was very interesting sort of thing. That pub is so old that where they shot that too. It's still there. I watched a guy on YouTube. He does a few things where he goes around and does locations around for movie. He did this one. He did one for The Chain Reaction, which is another great movie. I love that movie.
Yes.
And he did, I think he did some Mad Max stuff as well. But it's really interesting, like all the locations for this film are around Sydney. Like the pub is down in Balmain, or was in Balmain. I'm pretty sure it's probably still there, but it's probably an office or something these days. And then you've got the stuff at North Head and South Head, and you've got the scene at the opening scene. I only just found out today that opening scene where they've got the plaque for Captain Cook. So that's down in Kurnell, right? So they shot that in Kurnell. Sandy Harbutt wanted to go in there and shoot that scene. He went to the National Parks and Wildlife or whoever runs it, and they said, yeah, you can come in and do it, but it's going to cost you $250. For him, $250 is a lot of money making that movie.
Yep.
So he said, no thanks. He went down with his cameraman, saw there was no one there. They sort of snuck out, set up, and just cut. And this is so typical of movies made in this era, right?
Yes, it is.
Where they just guerrilla filmmaking, right? They just
it's like all of Terminator is all guerrilla filmmaking. Yeah. That's James Cameron being like, oh, quick, that's abandoned. Let's quickly duck over here and make this movie here. And like you can tell with Mad Dog Morgan, like I very much doubt anyone got any permits for that film whatsoever. Mad Max was the same. Like Mad Max has what happens with them is they're filming a lot around Melbourne, and there is no permitting system at that point. And they attract the attention of the police, who are like, oh, what's this about? And they're like, well, we're making Future Cop. Like, it's a Future Cop movie. And they're like, oh, that's cool. Can we help? And, you know, that's when government actually started paying attention to, you know, you going out and you're filming stuff. But yeah, if you got a very small budget to make this movie on, you're not going to spend $250 to essentially get what is one, you know,
one shot, 30 seconds.
Yeah. One tiny little shot there of I love these movies as well, speaking of those shots, because they're these lovely time capsules of an Australia that is well and truly gone now.
Well, for an old fart like me, right, it's like a lot of these movies I find really nice because I don't want to, now I sound like a boomer, and I always say I'm a non-practicing boomer, right? But it takes me back to like when I was growing up. Like if I see The Man from Hong Kong, for instance, and I see the Sydney skyline from The Man from Hong Kong, it's so different than it is now. And I go, God, I remember that. I remember that. I look at the cars and I go, I remember those cars. My dad had that car, or that sort of thing. And it's just so they are. All these movies are a fantastic time capsule of Australia and Sydney and all these other surrounds. And I think that's part of the appeal for me. But I think it's also the appeal for people that are just discovering them now as well.
Absolutely, and I fall into that category, and it gives you this interesting connection to your country and to our home. And it's funny though. I felt like I always had one foot in that particular era, because when you grow up in a small country town, the pub that they all have a fight out the front of, well, that very much reminds me of one of the pubs in Gundagai, because I grew up in Tumut. And it reminds me of like the Royal Pub in Tumut, and it reminds me of what my life was like growing up. And only recently we went over to, well, I say recently, about 5 years ago, we went over to New Zealand. And parts of New Zealand still look like that.
Yeah, parts of New Zealand are like Sydney in the 70s and 80s.
They are. They absolutely are. You know, it's like going back in time. Like there are parts of Sydney that you can still roam around now and still get that feel of, you know, maybe the 70s or the 80s. Like when you go down to Darling Harbour and they still have those housing commission houses that are still down there. A lot of that building and architecture is 1970s, 1980s. You know, you can still get that, but you know, the idea of pulling up in front of them, like they mention milk bars. Yeah. You know, milk bars, and a milk bar in Australia, they don't really exist now.
They don't really exist anymore.
You know, you go for a Mr. Whippy ice cream, or as my dad referred to them as a twirly whirly, because that's how they came out of the machine. So you go Sunday afternoon, you're going down and grab a twirly whirly soft serve ice cream from your local milk bar, where you'd also get a milkshake and maybe what my dad used to refer to as a medium of chips, whatever the fuck that means. You know, a medium of chips. And you know, that was what that era was. And these films allow us to sort of, you know, go back and sort of experience that as well. And it also, you get to experience 1980s Australia, which, you know, by today's standards is nowhere near as politically
charged.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Where it's like, you know, you can have topless scenes in movies, you can have male, female nudity all over the place. And then once Australia hits sort of the 1990s, we become a little bit more conservative in how we make films. And it's not until the revival of the horror film with Wolf Creek that suddenly everything is back on the table again, where it wasn't, you know, for a solid decade. If I'd seen a naked breast on television growing up as a kid in the 90s, I would have genuinely been shocked. You know, it wasn't until, like, do you remember the SBS Saturday night cult films?
Oh, yeah. So I remember these because I had one particular night I was playing a gig with a band at a club, I think was out near Seven Hills or something like that. And I think it was like was it like an ethnic sort of, like a German or Italian sort of club? And I'm on stage playing away and they've got the TVs up and around. And as an aside, I used to judge venues I'd play at by how good a view I got of the footy when the footy was on when I was playing. So I could play and I could watch the footy because I was playing the same songs 3 nights a week, right, for years. So it was like pretty much autopilot for a lot of it. And I never forget this gig. I'm sitting there, I'm playing away with my drums, and I just happened to look up and there's a TV showing SBS and there's this massive sex scene. What the fuck?
I remember when the host of that finished up, he did like his last introduction when SBS completely reformatted, and he did his last intro and he said, you know, I'll never forget the fan who came up to me in the pub and said, oh, you're the bloke who puts on the stuff on SBS. And he goes, yeah, mate, that's me. And he goes, mate, no, I always look forward to watching me pornos on Saturday night from you. And it's just because, like cult cinema and exploitation cinema, like it happened to do that. You know, there's films like Attack of the Killer Condom. It's exactly what it is, you know. Yeah. And Australia did a lot of that stuff as well. Like Chain Reaction, that's the nuclear panic film, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and for like there's no nuclear anything in Australia outside of like occasionally mining uranium that we don't even process here. It gets processed overseas. So it's like there really is no need to have a nuclear scare movie in this country, but you know, it's an era where you can get a little bit of funding to make that sort of horror film. And
well, it was around the time of like China Syndrome and stuff like that, those movies.
Yeah.
So that's where it all came from.
Yeah, every time it was like a feedback loop, you know, every time the Americans would do something, or, you know, I think though, like you would have to say Australian cinema was influenced more by European cinema at the time.
Yeah, in many ways.
You know, because our cinema has been produced by film students who are easily getting access to foreign films, as opposed to like, you know, you want to go and watch an American film in the 1970s, well, that's quite easy. And you're going to watch a movie like Star Wars, you know, for example. Whereas the people like Sandy Harbutt who are coming out of university, they've already been exposed to, you know, the start of avant-garde cinema, where you have auteur filmmakers who aren't beholden to the studio system. You know, when film first starts, you're dealing with a studio that says this is what you will do to the letter, and you will not deviate from it.
Yeah.
And then George Lucas does Star Wars, and you see things like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, and, you know, that's Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, the first auteurs. But the European auteurs were already ahead of them. You know, when they were making Star Wars, so the Europeans were starting to explore in, you know, they were the horror genre, the exploitation genre. Some of it was really good. Some of it is very, very bizarre. Psychic sex vampires coming out of England being, you know, one of them. And so I think Australian cinema around this time has been far more influenced by what's coming out of Europe than necessarily what was coming out of America.
I'd say there's that. It's probably a mix too, because there's still that exploitation part, which definitely I think really comes out of the US, that like core, hardcore exploitation stuff. Hey, I can't end this episode without talking about the music in this film.
I hated it.
It's so much a like the Blu-ray. I haven't listened to it yet, but I've got the Blu-ray here, the Umbrella one. It comes with the soundtrack.
Yes.
I haven't had a listen to it. I've got to rip it and have a listen to it. And it's so typical of the music of that time, the instrumentation and the bow, wow, 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 wow sort of thing. And there sounds like there's some sort of Rhodes piano in there with that sort of sound. And then you've got Doug Parkinson singing his thing, and he's very much a product of the 70s. And the music is really, some of it is good, some of it is not great, but they seem to play, you know, a lot of it, you know, in the right places. But it's just so much. It is one of the things that dates the movie badly, but also it also, once again, it's a time capsule. So it's another. This is what music was often like, especially in this movie where they're trying to get that alternative hippie sort of culture. It's a weird movie, right? Because it's almost like you were saying, it's almost like a hippie movie with bikies.
That's
like with hippie bikies. When you would think about hippies and bikies in the past, you would think, well, they would be on opposite sides, right?
Yeah,
like mods and rockers and all that sort of stuff. And it is a very strange movie in that way, but definitely, I would absolutely recommend this movie to anyone.
Oh, 100%. And I would as well. Like it's an example of exploitation Australian cinema that for 75% of the time probably gets everything it wants to get done, which is something that is, you can't really say with some other, like again, when I go back to something like Mad Doug Morgan, I feel like their mandate was to portray him in a positive light, or maybe give it the Ned Kelly angle, which is completely wrong for that particular bushranger. But they completely fuck it up, and it's a poorly constructed film. Whereas Stone, it's not a bad film, and if you excised about 10 minutes of it, I think you've got a pretty decent action, exploitation-y, little bit heady sort of movie.
Yeah. The original cut was 132 minutes.
That's insane.
I couldn't imagine what that would be like. And apparently Sandy Harbutt didn't see that cut until the premiere.
Yep.
He never saw it. And that's when he wanted to change it. And I think it was Roadshow or whoever's distributing it at the time said, it's a hit, don't change it. But eventually when he was able to sell it overseas and things like that, he was able to change it and cut it down to where it is now.
Yeah, because I watched the hour and a half version, and honestly, that's all you need. Like,
it's a very tight film the way it is now.
Yes. Yeah. Even with like I said, you know, there are probably scenes that I think that could have been changed to benefit the film. I think if you made a slight tweak to it and you remove the sort of bikie gang element, maybe turn them into more of like a outsider cult, like a hippie-ish cult, I think you probably nail everything he was trying to nail. Like, you know, maybe it's a group of people go into town and recruit all the ex-Vietnam veterans and stuff like that and be like, you know, society doesn't understand you, but we do. Because it just lightly hits on as well, you know, the post-world, the post-war culture for what happens to these men and women who come back after Vietnam. Like, Vietnam's a very unpopular war. The people who are fighting it are very unpopular, and for the first time in Australia's history, they're conscripted into a proxy war for powers that really didn't have any influence on Australia whatsoever. You know, it was just to prop up an alliance for America, which was just being used to prop up an alliance for France, just because they had to, you know, stop the evils of the Cold War. So it's, you know, it was a very unpopular war. And I like the fact that within this film, they address how these Vietnam veterans are sort of treated. It's like, you know, they came home, they don't have a support system, they don't have anyone to hear them out, to listen to them. So in this case, you know, they've all banded together to be sort of this counterculture. And I think to make it a bit more sensible, you'd probably turn them into a bit of a hippie-ish cult, which is what they are, really. I said, that's what they are. There are two things I did. I know you wanted to keep it to a tight hour, but two little things that I wanted to mention. Number one, the pure insanity of hiring an actual bikie gang, getting them drunk,
and paying them with beer, basically.
Paying them with beer and dope. I think I was watching the interview. He's like, yeah, you know, I handed in a receipt and it said, you know, paid to Hell's Angels for dope. And he's like, I can't take, this is not a receipt. And paying these people in beer and then just having them literally beat up your actual actors.
Yeah.
You know, and like they had interactions with him where one of them was like knocked into a car that he wasn't expecting, and the bikie guy's like, what, you're going to hit me? And, you know, he was like, no, I'm not going to hit you. And they discuss it later on and are good mates afterwards. But it's like, that to me is one of the wonderful things of Australian exploitation cinema, and also something that I think is terrifying about Australian exploitation cinema, because to put your actors to grab a bunch of film kids and then put them into this sort of situation, I think is very dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. You would never, like you said before, would never happen these days, right?
God, no. On a film set today, if you have a scene where the actor has to light a candle on a table, there's a safety meeting beforehand. You know, everything is... And to be fair, the reason for that is because sometimes you have director writers like Sandy Harbutt who hire a bunch of bikies, pay them in dope and booze, and then get them to beat up your actors. You know, so maybe there is a reason that we have these sort of standards. Or, you know, you think about like on-set deaths, like the death of Brandon Lee during The Crow. You know, just because safety regulations aren't followed to the T and people get hurt. Like in modern times, like, Michael Bay is notorious for having the most dangerous sets for, sadly, very mediocre films. You know, if you're going to die for your art, you at least want it to be a really good movie.
Exactly.
You know, that's how I'd like to go out. I'd like a really good movie to go out on, Pete, not a Michael Bay film. But yeah, so it's like putting your actors in that sort of danger, it seems crazy to me. And the fact that they're able to sort of pull it off, and it does look... It does look rehearsed, which I find is interesting, considering how much insanity is going on there. The other scene that sort of made me raise an eyebrow as well is where Stone has to strip off during his sort of initiation. He goes through this initiation rite, and it is so bizarre. So they know he's a cop, which also said, like, they're not bikies. They wouldn't let a cop come in and do an investigation.
Yeah.
Because he's like, you're all dying and I'm here to help, but I'm going to be a cop and I'm going to investigate. It's sort of like a ride along for this police officer, which is so weird. But during his like initiation, he has to strip off his clothes in the middle of all of them, put on some other biker's dirty clothes.
Yeah.
And I can't expect that's nice. And then they kick the shit out of him. And then when he's down on the ground, one of the bikie girls comes up and pierces his ear with a used syringe. And then he gets his ear piercing, which he's very, very happy with. And it's so bizarre.
Yeah, it's a very strange scene.
Like, I would imagine, like, a bikie initiation, you get drunk with everyone initially, and then they hit you with, like, beer bottles over your head. Like,
something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Or they get you to do something really stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Or maybe you have to do something really cool on your bike, which, to be fair, they get him to do a really cool sort of thing on his kind of
Well, they
cool.
have that bike race, right?
They do.
Yeah.
And he sort of, like, to pull off the corner's too tight, he does end up on the ground, but that sort of initiates him into the group. And that was another thing too. I kind of expected a lot more bike stuff.
Yeah, there wasn't as much as you think, right?
There really isn't. You've got
they cheat with the trailer. If you notice there's a shot in the trailer where the gunman guy it's from early in the movie where he kills the environmental guy. He takes a shot, but they take the very next shot after he pulls the trigger is Stone sliding off his bike.
Yes.
It's like he's been shot riding his bike. But, so I guess they weren't going to show a decapitation in the trailer like they did in the movie.
That's probably the most brutal part of it. As they're slowly assassinating, I think they end up killing maybe 6 or 7 of the gang members throughout the course of the film. And that particular scene is probably as gory and as gruesome as it gets when the guy puts up a fishing line and our gang member goes straight through it and loses his head. The head does the classic roll down the road. And, it all, like, it's shot in a way that they didn't have to spend a lot of money, but it sort of is probably the most confronting because on the whole, it's really not that violent of a film.
No, it's not.
They spend more time
saying man.
Yeah, saying man, hanging out, smoking dope, having, an early morning nude dip over in the ocean. All of these, and there's even a montage of Stone being like, hey, what do you think of these guys? And they're like, oh, lots of people hate them. Do you hate them? Nah, I think they're pretty good. And that plays out over the montage of like 3 or 4 different store owners who are like, oh, no, we're actually pretty happy to have these guys around.
Gary McDonald.
Yes. Yes.
Pre-mother and son, pre-Norman Gunston.
Yep. He's a happy mechanic. But you can see him in there. Like you can see him in there. I find that sort of stuff is quite funny. Just because, I think for Sandy Harbutt, he's trying to say the counterculture is pretty sweet, man.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. Yeah. And they're not as bad as you'll think they are, and they've got this way of doing things. There's like the code. There's one, Stone accidentally kisses one of the girlfriends, and not accidentally, I think he's keen. And afterwards he gets his ass kicked, and she's like, come on, like, we have a sister, man. Like, if she wanted to be with you, she'd be with you, dude. Like, yeah. And I'm like, don't preach at me that you're a counterculture, but you have a system of governance. Like, it's so strange how they do that. The other really weird element that took me out of the movie every time it happened is Stone's photographer/model girlfriend.
Oh, yeah.
They open the scene with him mixing egg yolk into orange juice. Was that a thing?
It probably was at the time.
So they do this weird egg white drink thing, whatever. I've never seen anyone mix an egg into an orange juice before, but they firmly establish just how supposedly straight-laced Stone is via his fiancée.
Yeah.
Now, the fiancée seems to have a direct line to his supervisor, this inspector that we see never, or maybe it's the inspector at the start of the movie. They're never quite clear on it, but every time, like, Stone is away for a long time, she'll call him up and be like, well, it'd be nice if I had my boyfriend back.
Yeah, or my tennis partner. We need another tennis player.
Yeah, we need another tennis player. And it's like she has this...
She's a bit annoying, actually.
It's ridiculous.
Like that scene where she's on the phone to him as well.
Yeah.
I'm like, geez, we could have done without this.
Or that whole character, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, we could have cut that character. So
yeah. And that I felt that her whole thing, like just the fact that she has a direct line to his supervisor and can give him shit is really, really strange to me.
As if you give her the time of day, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's like, why would you, like, I'm sure.
Why are you bothering me here?
Yeah, it's like, I've had enough of him being on assignment. You send him home right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And she's, to be fair, like, her character's a little bit spunky. Like, she does say to him, how would your girlfriend feel about you not being home on time? And he's like, I don't have a girlfriend, I have a wife. And she's like, I know what I said. You know, and I was like, okay, like, she's a bit sassy, but that is, it's so weird. And yeah, I also assume that a lot of the budget was spent on Stone's perm.
I'd say so.
He has glorious hair throughout the entirety of the film, which is unusual. Usually the glorious hair belongs to Hugh Keays-Byrne, especially when he gets into Mad Max. He has a lovely coif of hair.
Hugh Keays-Byrne has amazing hair, yeah.
But Stone rivals him for his haircut in that. Yeah, actually, I would say that out of the entire movie, Keays-Byrne is probably the only one that genuinely acts like a bikie.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's
really interesting how many of these guys went on to Mad Max as well.
Mm.
Like he did. Vince Gill went on to that. Roger Ward went on to that, and apparently quite a few of the production team went on to Mad Max as well. So it's almost like Mad Max's little brother, precursor.
Yeah, well, I assume that that Burns' character Toad, I assume that he survived his gunshot wound, and once the world fell apart, he became Toe Cutter.
Toe Cutter, yeah.
Right? Like, I can see that there's a clear delineation between those two characters from point A to point B. Like, that's the next Mad Max film that George Miller needs to make after he finishes filming Furiosa, is the missing years between...
Like a Toe Cutter origin story.
Yeah, so how did Toad become Toe Cutter in the intervening years between those two exploitation films? Because it's practically the same role. Yeah.
Cool. All right, so we'll finish our conversation about Stone, which we both loved. I really enjoyed it. I know it sounds like we've been going off on it a little bit, but it's a great film. I definitely would spend time and watch it if you can find it. I don't think it's streaming anywhere. I think you can get it on like Google Play, like pay for it.
Yes,
like that. And there's probably a cruddy YouTube version of it somewhere.
Yeah, watch
that's in 4:3 or something.
Yeah, don't watch the YouTube version. They're horrid.
I always plug Umbrella, even though they don't pay me to do so. Yeah, and but I would definitely go for their Blu-ray, which is amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Their Blu-ray is, if you're old school like me and you like your special features, which they don't do a lot anymore, their Blu-ray restorations are lovely. One of my friends here in Canberra actually knows the guy that does a lot of restoration work for Umbrella via the National Sound and Film Archives.
That's interesting, because I think that maybe that same guy reached out to me and sent me an email a little while ago.
Well, look at that.
I'll talk to you offline about that. But
small world.
He actually I mentioned him in the last episode. He reached out to me and just said, I'm enjoying the podcast. I listen to it while I'm doing the restoration work on these movies. So
yeah, Umbrella just inked a big deal not too long ago. But if you're ever looking for a lot of Umbrella stuff, they usually sell the streaming rights between Amazon and Netflix. So if you have Amazon Prime, I think Stone might be there, and then Netflix has their other share of it, because now in Australia, when it comes to streaming services, you're required to have a certain amount of Australian produced. And that's the easiest way to do it. But the Umbrella Blu-ray release is wonderful. The restoration is amazing. It's probably the best you're ever going to see this film. Sound as well, which is very important for me, is very, very good on that disc. And yeah, it's probably the absolute best way to watch Stone for sure.
All right. So in 1 second or less, no, in a few, give me an idea of what. So tell the people about your podcast first.
Cool.
What it's all about, and let them know where they can find you.
So whatever app you're listening to this podcast on right now, you can find my podcast called Weird Crap in Australia. For the last 5 years, going on 6 now, myself and my wife, partner in crime, Holly Soul, have been finding the weirdest Australian stories that you've never heard of. And we've done things like Mad Max. We've done exploitation film as well. Not as in-depth as you have, Pete. But we've also covered some of those stories that have been forgotten. It's like Australia thinks that we had one spree killer and then that was it. Gun control came in. There was actually a lot more. And one thing I say to people like yourself, Pete, who did experience the 70s and 80s, congratulations for surviving.
Surviving it.
You did very, very well. I
wasn't abducted or anything like that.
No, you weren't abducted by aliens. You didn't get shot at.
I wasn't abducted from the Wanda Sandhills or anything. Yeah.
So, we cover all of that sort of fun stuff. We've covered, some of Australia's long-forgotten UFO encounters. The Cahill encounter that was mentioned on season 11 of The X-Files, the revival season. We covered all of that. We've looked after every single monster that you could possibly think of, even a couple of that you haven't. And we take that very larrikin Australian, everything is up for a laugh sort of attitude to all of the episodes that we do. And we have a companion book series as well. We Crap in Australia, Volume 1 to 3 is out now. Volume 4 comes out in September.
Excellent. And where are you on the socials?
So with the social media, you can find us on Facebook. We have our We Crap in Australia Facebook group. You can also find us on Twitter. The handle is @WeirdCrapInAus. Instagram is Weird Crap in Australia, same as Mastodon and Hive if you need those Twitter alternatives. And you can shoot us a good old-fashioned email to weirdcrapinaustralia@gmail.com if you want to be old like me.
That's the way to do it. It's always good to have an email. So.
Absolutely.
That's cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great having you as a guest.
It's been really a pleasure.
Very easy conversation, and you're obviously excited about this film, which is great, and your knowledge is fantastic. So it was really good talking to you. It was great catching up with you before we pressed record as well, talking about all things Wiggles and all that sort of stuff. So, so thank you so much for coming on.
Not a worry at all. It was an absolute pleasure.
Great. And when we come back, we'll talk about what's coming up next.
And now, preview time. When it comes to entertainment, you can't beat a good film. So let's take a look at what's coming your way.
Now, Australia's colossal comedy hit, starring its newest comedy hero, comes to the States. Yahoo Serious is Young Einstein.
Albert Einstein.
He is destined to create the most powerful scientific theories in history.
I discovered the formula for splitting beer atoms.
Only one girl is brilliant enough to understand him.
My name is Marie Curie.
Only one man is low enough to steal from him. Albert discovers that there are even worse things in the big city than a cat pie. For example,
an atomic bomb.
If ever the world needed a revolutionary new theory, it's now. At last, the incredible untold story of the greatest mind of all time. Albert Einstein, thrill seeker, lover, adventurer, genius.
Who is this barbarian? I'm a Tasmanian.
Warner Brothers proudly presents Yahoo Serious as Young Einstein. One seriously funny movie.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. Thank you to all my guests who give their time to make this podcast possible, and a special thanks to you for listening. Don't forget you can follow A Dingo Ate My Movie on social media. We're at Dingo Movie on Twitter, Dingo Movie Pod on Facebook and Instagram, and we're on the web at dingomoviepod.com. If you'd like to support the show, leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, or share the show with your friends. Of course, you can always buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/dingomoviepod. Once again, thanks for listening, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next episode of A Dingo Ate My Movie.
Now look, nobody's got to know that this cat's a pig. So just keep your head shut and we'll be all right, okay? Okay.